just put your camera off, or if you've got dogs barking or kids crying, it's all fine. We're just glad you could be here with us today. LEAD is the acronym for Lay Leader Equipping and Developing. And so 2 weeks ago, we kicked off our series of a good understanding of who we are and how we function. And then we're going to pick up things today with the second part of that, non-anxious leadership part 2, healthy relationships. What does it mean to function well as leaders with each other? It's great if you were able to tune in for part 1 or were able to catch it on our YouTube channel, but you don't have to necessarily have had to see part 1 to understand and benefit from part 2. I do recommend that you go back and watch that, though, if you get a chance. And like I said, it's on the Central Conference YouTube channel. And all of the teaching portions of the workshops are recorded and will be housed on that channel. The discussions portions will not, so you can feel free to discuss, and those will not be recorded. But teaching for us today, once again, is Reverend Dr. Juan Kim. Juan is the pastor of discipleship at New Community Bronzeville in the great city of Chicago. He is also an adjunct professor at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology and holds a doctorate in organizational leadership with expertise in emotional intelligence. But like I always say, the very, very best part about Juan is his heart for the Lord, his heart for people, and his heart for the church. So before I hand things over to Juan, I'd like us to begin with a word of prayer. So if you could just please join me in prayer. Lord God, our creator and our sustainer, we thank you so much for bringing us together to talk about your church, what it means to be your hands and feet in a broken world, what it means to work together to help bring heaven to earth for your name's sake. Give us wisdom as we listen for your voice and humility as we love one another. God, please be with Juan as he teaches us today. And may all that is said and done be for your glory and our good. We pray this in your precious and in your holy name. Amen. I'm going to hand it over to you, Juan.
All right. Thanks so much, Jill. I appreciate the introduction. And I'm seeing some familiar faces, which is good from last time, so it's good to chase you away. But some new faces too, so that's encouraging. So I'm going to try my best, and hopefully you can see my screen now. And you don't see my Zoom controls, right, at the top here. That was a mistake I made last time. So you only see the slide, right, hopefully?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Great, so I'm gonna try my best to make sure that if you were not on the call for the first part, that you don't feel like you're kind of caught off, or you're sort of walking into the middle of a movie, that kind of feeling. But as Jill mentioned, in part 1 of non-anxious leadership, we covered the interior life, the interior aspects of non-anxious leadership. And in this 2-parter, we're really focusing on the framework of emotional intelligence as sort of our lens through which we're going to discuss and think about non-anxious leadership. It's not the only way to do it, but I find it to be a helpful lens because it's pretty easy to understand, though not always easy to practice. It's at least, it's easy to grasp. And so there's less of a barrier in that sense. I think these are, language that's not going to be too academic in nature. It's easy to apply. And so that's kind of why I chose to use this framework. So what I'm going to do, and what we're going to focus on in part 2 is on the healthy relationships. So part 1 was more sort of what's going on internally, self-awareness. In part 2, today, we're going to talk much more about, well, what does that look like in practice as I relate to other people, as I try to kind of get a sense for other people's, where their emotions are, where their mood is, where their tension might be. It's a little bit more focused on the interpersonal aspects of emotional intelligence. Okay, so just a quick rundown of the agenda. We'll go over the purpose, a brief intro to emotional intelligence. If you were on part 1, some of this might sound familiar, but it's always good to get reinforced. It's been a couple weeks. My guess is you've not probably gone back and watched it unless you had a lot of time on your hands or it was just so compelling, which I'm not gonna assume that was probably the case of having you rewatch it. So it's just a good reminder, even if you were on part 1, just to kind of get a sense for the theory overall. Then we're going to sort of zoom in on, again, those exterior components, the more relational components of emotional intelligence. And really throughout, I'm going to try to give you some practical applications, so you walk away from this with a really good sense for how I can practice this right when this call's over. Literally with maybe the person with your spouse, with your children, certainly with congregants, whoever is in your daily life. I'm hoping that you'll be able to apply this material really right away. And I'm actually going to give you some homework toward the end here that'll kind of help you think through kind of how to do that in a really effective and targeted way. And as Jill mentioned, the first part, so about the first 30 minutes or so, will be this more teaching element component where I'm kind of talking. And then the last half we're keeping for Q&A and for some discussion questions as well. So we're going to try to move fairly briskly through this first part so we can get to the part where we get to hear from you. So the purpose of this session today is to introduce emotional intelligence, really to equip the church with practical examples and exercises to strengthen interpersonal skills. So again, the focus today is on that relationship building piece. Jill already talked about me, so I'm going to go ahead and skip that part. I gave last time, I gave kind of a few examples of where we see Jesus displaying different kinds of emotions in Scripture. So I'm not going to go through those specific examples again, other than just to say that we see our Lord really exhibit a wide variety of emotions in the Gospels. What I want to point out about this today is really in every situation where Jesus shows emotion, ultimately his purpose in that emotion is to point toward God in some way. So it's pointing toward God's justice when Jesus is angry, turning over tables. Or just the lack of equity in the temple, right, where the Gentile worship space was being violated with merchants and noise, and they're just not being allowed to worship as intended. Or he's pointing toward God's love, or toward God's compassion when he's mourning with people and weeping with people. So it's always with the purpose of glorifying the Father, right? It's not about Jesus himself necessarily. He's not showing emotion for the sake of showing emotion or for justifying himself. He's doing it to point to the Father. And so I would say likewise with us, certainly all of us are going to have our moments where we have a display of emotion that we're not proud of, or we react because we feel like our needs aren't being met. And that can be okay. We're not Jesus after all. But I would say in terms of stewarding our emotions, what's really important to remember, I think, is the same kind of thing that we see with Jesus, is our emotions, when stewarded in a healthy and productive way, will point toward God. They'll point toward Jesus in really profound ways. And so in that sense, and this came up in part one, the question of is anger appropriate? And I would say it is totally appropriate to get upset, to get angry when we see injustice happening. Right? It is totally appropriate and good for us to get angry, but we also need to be pointing toward God in that anger, to not make it about us, right? But to point toward God, even in something like anger. Certainly when we mourn with people, when tragedy strikes, that is also pointing toward God, because God's heart breaks as well when there's loss of life, when there's wildfires, when creation is suffering, right? And of course, it's great for us to be joyful and to celebrate when God blesses us, God blesses our church, God blesses our family. God wants us to enjoy his good gifts. And so that points toward God as well. So I hope that makes sense, just sort of a different way to think about the value of emotions, because these are given to us. And just like everything else, God gave us emotions to glorify him. And so hopefully that's a helpful way to kind of start this conversation in terms of thinking about, well, why does this matter? I would say it matters because God made us this way, but it's also if we channel our emotions in healthy and really submitted ways to God, then he gets glorified. So I hope that's encouraging. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of this more heady stuff, because that's ultimately what the goal is here. Okay, so just two pieces to remember in terms of understanding emotional intelligence sort of on a high level. It's one, the ability to recognize and understand emotions in yourself and in others, and then using that awareness to manage your relationships and your behavior, right? So the interior work of self-awareness, self-management, kind of regulating, and then the expressions of that both in your behavior, but also how it affects those around you. I walked through this last time as well, and I'm going to kind of do a briefer version of this. So, and if you want the more detailed explanation of this, feel free to go back to part 1 on our YouTube channel and check that out. But basically what you're seeing in front of you is that the feeling center of our brain, so the limbic system, kind of right smack dab in the middle of our brains, is the feeling center. And what happens is when we receive information from the world around us, any sort of stimulus or things we see, hear through our senses, it gets processed through that part of our brains before it gets to our frontal cortex, which is the thinking center. So if you see on the right side on your slide here, system 2 is the thinking center, and system 1 is your feeling center. So you kind of see that system 1's outpacing, right? Your feelings, your sort of primal instincts process information before your rational center. And so if left completely unchecked, we're just going to react out of that primal instinct. Sometimes that's good. A lot of times that's not good, because we're going to respond inappropriately or in ways that are just not helpful. So what emotional intelligence teaches is that as we hone those skills, we find that we more effectively communicate between those parts of our brains. We don't abandon the feeling center, but we have better control over it. Actually, in my Bible reading this morning, I was in Genesis, and in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, God says to Cain, right before he murders his brother, God says to Cain, "Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." And so it's kind of the same idea here, right? We all have those impulses in us. None of us are without the sinful impulse. The question is, are you going to act on it? Are you going to choose to indulge that feeling? And for some of us, it's so unhoned, it's so untrained that it feels like it's not even a choice, right? That we're just reacting because we're sort of enslaved to it. But as Jesus matures us in our discipleship, I would say a huge piece of that is when our emotions come under God, right? And the Holy Spirit transforms us, and we're able to have that ability through the Holy Spirit to rule over our emotions. God wouldn't have said this to Cain if it wasn't possible, right? He just chose not to do it, but the choice is always there. And so that's, I think, maybe sort of a simpler way to think about this is, what do you do when you get that initial sort of impulse to react out of emotion? And that's really what we're talking about here with emotional intelligence, is how do we notice it quickly, and then how do we act on that in a way that's going to be more Christ-like? All right, so moving on. This is sort of the wide overview of the emotional intelligence theory. There's 4 different components to it. Today, we're going to focus on this right side column here, so the social competence pieces of social awareness and relationship management. But just so we're all on the same page, I'm going to go ahead and do a quick overview of what self-awareness and self-management look like, and that will give you a sense for kind of how these all kind of fit together. So kind of starting on the top left here, self-awareness, it's fairly self-explanatory. It's just a question of how well you know yourself. How well do you know your limitations, your biases, your trigger points, and how willing are you to be honest about those things? This is really the foundational emotional intelligence skill. If you're really weak in self-awareness, it's really hard to be strong in the other areas, because a lot of it sort of hinges on how well you know yourself and how well you're willing to face the music about your own shortcomings and your sort of shadow sides, right? Now, it's not all bad. I mean, this part of self-awareness is to also recognize the gifts that God's given you and to really play out of your strengths and work out of your strengths. But we have to know those things well enough in order to understand how God made us to be able to express and build the other aspects of emotional intelligence. Moving down to self-management, the question here is, how well can you sort of regulate yourself, right? How well, when it's an emotional situation, when it's an anxious situation, how well do you channel that? How well do you compose yourself? And how are you sort of reacting on the spot to those types of situations? Moving to social awareness, this is really the ability to accurately pick up on the emotions in other people and understand what's going on with them. So these are the beginnings of empathy, right? To start noticing in someone's body language, maybe they're kind of looking down, they just look tired. You sort of get better at kind of picking up on these things. And it helps you kind of understand what kind of questions you can ask someone, how can you be praying for them. It just sort of gives you this almost sixth sense of being able to read people and kind of hear where they are, or see where they are without them even having to say much to you. And then lastly, we have this relationship management piece. This is sort of where the culmination of the other three kind of expresses itself in relationship. Self-awareness is sort of the foundational piece, and then the other two kind of play off of that, and then that all sort of leads to where your relationships, how well you manage them. One of the sort of keys to relationship management, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later as well, is people who are high in relationship management see the benefit of being around folks and being in a relationship with folks that they don't particularly like, or maybe don't see an immediate benefit from. Maybe personalities you just have a hard time getting along with. And the reason they're good at this is one, because they see that we're all created differently, right? And it takes really a team effort. It takes the whole family of God in order to do the work of God. But also it's, I think there's a humility that comes when you are highly self-aware of recognizing, I may not like these things about this person, but there's things about me that aren't particularly likable either. And so if I'm expecting others to be okay with my shortcomings, then I need to be okay with someone else's, right? And so there's that sort of humility that develops, and really seeing the benefits of being around people who, again, you may not naturally gravitate towards. And the way the conflicts sort of emerge, if you're avoiding people who aren't like you, is these things fester, right? Someone might feel neglected, especially as a leader. If you're playing favorites, even if it's by accident, it's really going to create problems. And these passive aggressive sort of situations might emerge, or just straight up avoidant behavior, where problems that really need to be confronted are not being discussed. And so you can really see as a leader how quickly these things can unravel on you if you're not aware of your own blind spots and then not acting on them when you do see them. So it's important to surround yourself with people who can be honest with you. So that's just a kind of a quick overview of the theory as a whole, and we're going to spend the rest of this time, the teaching components, kind of diving into the two areas of social awareness and relationship management. I know I'm going kind of fast, but we are going to have a good amount of time for question and answer. So if you feel like you're going to lose your question, I would actually encourage you just to type it in the chat, and then I can take a look at it at the end of this. So whatever is helpful for you, whether it's just taking notes or putting in the chat right now, it's totally fine. Okay, so looking at social awareness, a question I would ask myself around this is, can I read and empathize with others' emotions and moods? Can I empathize? Yeah, can I read them, and then can I empathize with them? So the way I kind of organize these sections is thinking about sort of ministry checks. So are these things that you're good at or not good at, and how does that affect your ministry? And then maybe your answers to those questions will indicate which of these healthy practices and habits that I talk about might be appropriate for you. So it's almost like a question and answer, trying to answer, sort of think through what would be most helpful for somebody who is newer to this type of material. So hopefully this framework will help you kind of grasp some of this material. So first question is, how well do you read body language? Now this is particularly tricky, right? Because we're spending so much more time distanced from each other that we're kind of losing the ability to do this. But I would say it's all the more important, perhaps, when you are able to see someone face to face, or even via a video conference like this, to be able to kind of hone that. Now, you don't want to overly rely on reading someone's body language, because you could be very wrong. But if you're able to hone that, then people can really kind of give themselves away a lot of times in the way that their posture is, or they're, sort of looking away, that type of thing. Sort of in concert with that is the question of, do you listen attentively? Now this, I think, is going to take really sort of center stage right now, because we're distanced and we're relying much more on either audio, right? If we're on the phone, or even in this, it's someone's inflections, the way that they're talking. Those things are going to be a little bit more important right now. And so I would say pay special attention to how well you listen. And we're actually going to do a little bit of a deep dive into some active listening in a moment. And then the last question, this is more sort of a self-reflection, is, Are you others focused or are you self-focused? Certainly there's times where we need to be focused on ourselves, to recharge, to spend time with the Lord, to be re-energized. But I would say if we're dwelling too much on ourselves, then we're going to miss the prompts that people around us are giving us, right? If I'm thinking only about myself, it's going to be hard for me to read someone else's body language, or it's going to be hard for me to listen to someone because I'm just caught up with my own stuff. And so that's a good question to ask yourself, particularly as a leader in the church, right? You don't we have been called to stand in the gap and to put ourselves second at times, for the benefit of others. So again, not always, right? This is not a saying that you should neglect yourself or your needs, but kind of understanding how to balance those things in a healthy way. So then kind of moving toward the healthy practices. What I think really this requires to develop your social awareness is to be present and attentive to people, especially when it's mundane or boring, especially if you feel like you're having the same conversation with someone over and over again. And I'm willing to bet in this last 6+ months, you've got folks who you've talked to and they're dealing with the same things, right? Even more so now with COVID, and this is dragging on. People are feeling really dragged down, right? And maybe some of the same issues are coming up over and over again, and you're going to feel like, I've heard this already, and it's just so easy to tune out or to start drifting, thinking about other things, or look at your phone, those kinds of things. So important for us to try to stay as present as possible with people, because they will notice. They will notice if you're drifting, if your attention is drifting. Kind of along with that, notice people's body language, as yours as well as others, right? You want to also be aware of kind of what message you're sending out with your body language. So if you're having a conversation with someone and you're kind of sitting back, your arms folded, you may not mean anything by it, but what you may be communicating by accident to someone is, just sort of a standoffish kind of tone. And you don't want to do that, right? So things like nodding, kind of leaning forward a little bit, maintaining consistent eye contact that's not creepy, can be very helpful. Kind of along with that, greeting people by name I find to be pretty effective. Don't do it all the time, but I find that it's just a way to kind of engage somebody and it just helps them feel seen. Again, particularly right now, a lot of people don't feel seen. So this is just a simple way to be able to maybe just get someone to feel like, oh wow, they said my name, they see me. Lastly, active listening, and we're going to kind of do a deeper dive into that, but I want to kind of talk about kind of the moment we're living in a little bit more. We're living in a very distracted world, in a very distracted time by many, many things. And sometimes, honestly, it's just, I'm finding this for myself, it's just easier to sort of just zone out or to sort of disengage. It's so easy to do that with our phones, especially, right? And it's easy, frankly, if you've got kids at home and you're like around them all the time. I'm living this life right now with my 4-year-old and 2-year-old. It just gets so tempting to just kind of just be there, but not really be with them. Does that make sense? So, what kind of quality time are you spending with people? I think quantity feels like less of an issue probably these days for many of us, but I think quality is really a question, right? What does quality look like, especially with your loved ones? Yeah, so just a note about that as we're kind of living through some very strange times, and hopefully I think actually that would be amazing, right? If we were able to be more present with people, think about if we could carry that over beyond this point whenever the virus is resolved, right? That would be amazing if we could walk away from this being more present and attentive to each other. Okay, so I'm gonna talk about active listening. So this is a picture of my dog. Yeah, she's really cute, right? So what active listening is really about is seeking understanding. Okay, so the framework I want you to think about using is very simple. Stop, look, and listen. So this is kind of putting into practice the being present, really using effective body language, healthy body language to communicate to somebody, hey, I'm with you. The purpose is to seek understanding and not to seek inquiry. And this is really hard for some of us who are very curious. And it's okay to be curious, but we first want to make sure that we understand where someone's coming from before we start asking leading questions. We start diving into things that maybe they weren't necessarily wanting to or willing to share about. So it's really important to check in with people as they're talking. And you want to make sure that they're the ones who are talking most of the time and that you are truly the listener role. So again, nodding, saying, yes, I'm with you, kind of just indicating, hey, I'm with you. And when it is your chance to talk, when there's sort of natural gaps in the conversation, using phrases like it sounds like or it seems like can be really sort of soft entries into kind of checking your understanding, right? So for example, if somebody was just kind of sharing about their morning, then I could say, it sounds like you were with your kids all morning. It sounds like you were a little bit anxious about that, and that's what made you late for this webinar. Something like that, right? So then they can then say, oh, you know what, actually, anxious doesn't sound like, that's maybe a stronger word than I was wanting to communicate. And then they can kind of go on and kind of elaborate there. Or they might say, yeah, that sounds right. And then they kind of take it from there where they want to go. So it's not you directing that conversation, it's them directing that conversation where it's helpful for them to go. Does that make sense? And as the conversation goes on, I think you can get into more of that inquiry piece, but really after you've built up that trust with someone. And I would say this framework is particularly helpful when you're dealing with someone who's a little anxious or someone you don't know very well. It's a good way to just build some trust with them, so they see, you're with me, you're on my side here, you're listening, you're truly listening to what I'm saying. And not trying to give me advice or you have some sort of agenda other than what I've brought to the table. So just another sort of way to think about this could be just to keep the spotlight on the speaker, right? If you sort of think about like a stage and the light is on that person, you don't want to shift that spotlight away. You don't want to take it away from them. You want to keep it on them as much as possible. Okay, I realize I am once again going slightly over my time, so I'm going to try to speed things up here. Going into relationship management, the question here is, can I empathize with others and manage conflict in healthy and productive ways? How can I tell whether I'm doing this well? One is, I would ask yourself, how clear of a communicator are you? And maybe you want to ask some people around you, how clearly do I communicate? What does that look like? What do you typically hear from me? When I'm sending an email, when I'm on the phone with you, when I'm talking with you in person, am I being clear in what I'm saying? Are you a conflict avoider? This is huge. This is so common. I am also a conflict avoider, so there's no shame, but it's something that we need to know about ourselves. And there's times when we're just going to have to sort of, buck up and face that conflict, because it's going to be what's best for us, and it's going to be what's best for that person, because we need to confront these things head on. Doesn't mean we go in aggressive, but it does mean that we have to be real about conflicts in our lives before they fester and really blow up. Are you a genuine person? This is really important. It's so important to have integrity and to be authentic. Doesn't mean that you're just, without boundaries or just sharing things that are inappropriate, but it does mean that you are a real person, that you're yourself. You're not putting on fronts for someone. You're not a different person, when you're preaching, say, than when you're just in the fellowship hall chatting. It's important to have integrity in who you are. Lastly, do you treat all people equally? This is really hard to do. Again, I mentioned this earlier. People who are high in relationship management are very consistent with all kinds of people, even those they don't particularly like. And it's hard to get there. It really is. But this is why it's such an important question to ask yourself is am I playing favorites? Do I just tend toward people who are like me? Or am I able to kind of meet people where they are? It's really hard, but it's so important. It's so important to ask. Some ways we can help kind of develop that. Number one is be curious. I know this sounds a little bit like it's flying in the face of the active listening, but I don't think so, because I think being curious about someone is what leads to good active listening, right? Because you're curious about their story. You're curious about where they're coming from. And so you're going to listen well with that, and that's going to help you sort of reflect back to them what you're hearing. And then if appropriate, then you can ask some additional questions, particularly if it's like a pastoral or counseling session where you have to be very careful, right? Kind of how much you project onto somebody, but it might help you if you're curious. It might help you to ask some really good, insightful questions for someone that could really get them thinking and lead them a little bit closer to where God might want them to be. So curiosity, I think, can be very helpful. You want to be building trust with people, as I said. That's really your focus. Don't assume trust. You can't assume that that somebody trusts you as much as you think maybe you've earned, or your title might earn you. We should never really assume that. I think it's important to remember that we always are needing to build trust with folks. Take feedback well. This is really hard to do, but it will really help you grow tremendously, not just in relationship management, but really in all aspects of emotional intelligence. If you take feedback well, it's really going to help you grow. Even if it's really hard, even if it's hard things to hear, those are the things that we really do need to hear. It goes back to being humble. It goes back to recognizing, look, I'm not perfect and no one's perfect. So it's just about how do we sharpen each other. And then there's a couple of team exercises you can do. I'm going to kind of expand on this magic carpet exercise in a minute. But there's also one called I think it's pronounced Zion, I guess, exercise. And if you're interested in this, I can send you kind of the script for how to do this. It's really fun. It's really meant for honing active listening skills in an intercultural environment. And it actually, in the role play, it actually flips traditional gender norms. And it's actually kind of fun to see men have a really, really hard time basically staying quiet and not kind of being allowed to dominate conversation. And men, let's be honest, that's something we're sort of almost taught to do, really. And this is hard for us to take on the role of a listener. And so it's a really cool exercise. I'd encourage, if anyone's interested in that, particularly if you're in a multicultural context, it can be kind of helpful. So let me know after this if you were interested in that. I want to kind of talk a little bit more about this magic carpet exercise because this one's kind of a lot of fun. Now, it'd be pretty hard to do socially distanced, but I think you could probably pull it off if you have a small enough group and you're all wearing masks and you're being safe. Or you can just wait till COVID's over. But this would be sort of a group exercise, and it's a team building exercise. And it's a lot of fun. So the prompt, and I'm going to read this for you because it's kind of silly, but it's kind of fun, is you're standing on a magic carpet and you're flying high above the clouds. But suddenly you realize you're heading in the wrong direction. Now, in order to reverse course, you must flip over the magic rug. And naturally, of course, anyone steps off the carpet will plummet to his or her demise. But your task is to turn the carpet upside down, okay, as a team, and everyone must remain standing on it with at least 1 foot on at all times. So what this is ultimately about is, it's sort of like you wouldn't think this just looking at this exercise, but what you're kind of paying attention to is 2 different things. One's called task communication and the other's called relationship or maintenance communication. Task communication involves problem solving language, so direction giving, information seeking, information giving, elaborating. It's tactical, right? You go there, you try this. Someone who's kind of directing people around. Relationship or maintenance communication involves sort of more about maintaining relationships. So it's people who are supportive or encouraging, harmonizing, maybe the tension relievers, the ones making a joke, right? It's kind of being aware of kind of the feel in the room. How are people feeling about this right now? Are we still having fun? These are both really important to have, right? Now, in order to accomplish this, you need somebody who you need folks who can kind of have a strategy in mind for how we're going to accomplish this. But you also don't want a dictator telling you where to go and what to do all the time, right? That's no fun. That's the point of this, is to be fun. And so after you do this, you want to, while you're doing it, you want to kind of pay attention to who's falling into which roles, right? Who sort of naturally falls into direction giving, who sort of falls naturally into more nurturing roles. And you want to debrief that as a group. And I bet people's eyes are going to be open because those are probably the norms they fall into, or the roles they fall into when you have any sort of meeting or strategy session. These are probably where they fall. But this would be kind of a fun way to see that on display and to debrief that. I think people will really be like, wow, I really do that. And then I think what hopefully will happen is you'll see an appreciation for the opposite style, right? And seeing that, hey, in fact, we need to work together, but we need to communicate between these styles as well. It can't just be you're the one in charge of this and I'm the one in charge of this. It has to be recognizing the value, but also seeing, how do we work together to do this well without steamrolling people in the process. So it could be a lot of fun again. So yeah, check that one out or try it out if you're interested. And I can send you a longer blurb on how to do this if you're curious. All right, well, we're going to wrap up with a couple of things. I'm going to give you an emotional health check as a sort of a summary, and then a little bit of homework and kind of things you can think about as a team, and then we're going to roll into our Q&A. So I've talked a lot, and so what I want to do is just sort of take a step back and kind of basically sort of summarize, why is this important? It's so easy for us right now, I think, to be completely unaware of how anxiety is affecting our mental states, our emotions, but also our decision making. And I think many of us might be operating out of anxiety and out of an unhealthy emotional place and mindset without even realizing it. So a couple of questions I want to ask is, are you being impatient with people? It's a good way to be able to tell if you're maybe not in the best place. Are you being impatient with people? And then are you fatigued? Are you worn out? In the last part, I mentioned the acronym HALT: hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. If you're any of those things, hungry always a big one for me. But if you're any of those things, it's just gonna be so much easier to be triggered, right? And if you're constantly angry, constantly lonely, constantly tired, it's gonna be really hard to be operating out of a healthy place. One of the things I found helpful for me is to focus on others when I'm feeling this way, is to serve. And I think what happens is when I sort of take the spotlight off myself and put it on someone else, it kind of gets me out of that funk a little bit. I find wells of empathy in me that I didn't really know I had, for one. And it just helps me see, God's working in this person. And they're speaking truth into my life too. And it just really helps to see that, what, I'm not meant to do this on my own. God created the church as a family because we're meant to do this together, right? None of us has the capacity or the ability or the wisdom or the strength or energy to do this on our own. We're meant to do this together. And so if that's helpful for you, to take a step off or take a step away from yourself and just admit to someone, a trusted person, hey, I'm really having a hard time with some of this stuff. Can you help me out? Can we have a conversation? I think that'll really go a long way. So if nothing else, I hope that this helps you recognize and ask yourself these questions of, am I being impatient and am I tired? Like beyond excessively tired. I know we're all actually somewhat tired right now, but really to a point where it's unhealthy. Really, I think it's important to kind of confront that in ourselves. So that leads very nicely to our homework. What I want you to do is choose one of the components of emotional intelligence that we talked about, and then just pick one of the habits. It could be one that I gave you. It doesn't have to be. You could just pick one of those things. If it's self-awareness, you can go back to part 1 and kind of see some of the suggestions I had for that area. So after you pick that habit or that practice, find 1 or 2 trusted people you can practice with. If it's more of a self-reflection kind of thing, then the person you're identifying will be more helpful for accountability purposes. But if it's more of a relational thing, then find a couple people you can really trust who are with you in this and can be supportive. And what I want you to do is just practice this new habit just a few times a week for a month. It doesn't have to be all the time, doesn't have to be every day. Just with that person, just try to set some time aside, even if it feels really artificial. It's just a matter of kind of getting those muscles developed. Keep record of it if you can when you practice it, because I think that'll be helpful for you to kind of see your own progress over the course of that month. And if you didn't find an accountability partner, then please find one for this. It can be so helpful. Maybe you can connect with different people who are on this call if you know each other. Just, you can't do this alone. And trust me, after about a week, give it over a couple days, you're going to stop doing it if you're not sort of having to report back to someone else that you're doing it, and maybe vice versa. It can be really helpful to have somebody to kind of partner with in this. So yeah, I mean, go for it, and keep us posted if that's a helpful way in terms of how you're progressing on this. Okay, just a couple notes about culture building, either in your leadership teams, your ministry staffs, or your church as a whole. Emotional intelligence can be understood kind of at an individual level, but I think it's particularly powerful when it's looked at in a culture making sense. So how do you cultivate healthy emotional intelligence habits across your church, especially active listening? If active listening becomes a common posture and approach across your church, it's going to be an incredibly loving place. You just imagine, right? So, but you have to start small. So start with your leaders, start with, and practice that. And then that will become infectious in a good way. It will become contagious for people to be like, oh, that's really cool. I feel really loved by this. How'd you do that? And kind of paying attention to, wow, that person really listened well. And that can really spread in a church, particularly these days. And focus on building healthy cultures and expectations. Maybe there's a new ministry team that's starting, or, you always want to be paying attention to the kind of culture that you're developing in anything that you're doing tactically. It's important to make sure you're balancing those things really well. Okay, well, that will end my am I talking at you? It looks like we have some chats here. I haven't seen them, so we can take a look there. But I think we're going to go ahead and end the recording now, right? I can't see it on my screen, so I'm just going to trust Patty that you're on top of that part. And we can transition to question and why don't we do question and answer?